I want to get into the top level question. Representative King, I'll start with you first. When we talk about accountability, who are we holding accountable? Are we holding students accountable? Are we holding teachers accountable? Are we holding leadership accountable? Are we holding parents accountable? Are we holding the community accountable? Are we holding the state accountable? All of the above, none of the above, what?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it.
That might work in Canadian, but it doesn't work here.
Yeah, you can ask, I mean, I suppose it would be all of the above.
Right.
But as far as from a funding standpoint, we're obviously holding our students accountable and our schools accountable to make sure students are making it to post-secondary education or career and technical. So, but I do believe accountability starts at home and goes all the way up through the school system. Yeah. But you know, the part of accountability you can't ever account for is good parenting. I mean, there's some things that we just cannot legislate, and it's never going to work. And it doesn't matter how much money we put in it or how strict we are or how loose we are on the accountability. There's some things that just cannot be legislative, and morality and good behavior is one of those things.
But you would accept, Representative King, that whoever is intended to be held accountable by accountability systems in public education, at the end of the day, the people who suffer is a word I don't want to use too dramatically here, but ultimately it's the students who end up in the target zone of accountability measures. Whether you're intending to hold schools or teachers or principals or what have you, districts accountable, it's the students who ultimately are on the receiving end of that, are they not?
I would agree. I would agree with that. That's the population that we're measuring, and everybody involved is accountable for their portion of it. But the students are definitely in the crossfire of it. You know, the biggest problem I see with the current accountability system, and particularly the old system we had in Texas, is if you have a kid that can pass the START test in 3 through 8, and the teacher knows it, in many cases that kid gets a day off. Well, that's a disservice to that child as well as the children that aren't coming along as fast. I think we need to use the accountability measure from the test for what it should have been intended for, as a measuring metric only, and not part of the overall accountability system, because every child grows different, every school district grows kids different. Everybody has a different experience, and one size doesn't fit all. Right. Local control.
Yeah, Lizzette, when you were at TEA and when you were working in the federal government and thinking about accountability as a component of education policy, who were you targeting in that? Who were you trying to hold accountable?
Holding accountable school districts. The idea really, I mean, accountability has really kind of gone on steroids to the extent that it's viewed as, you know, this high stakes measure on the students themselves, and then eventually on the parents, right? And that was never the intent. The intent was to provide the states information about school districts and how they were educating their kids. Right.
It's right there on the TEA website. You can't improve what you can't see. In order to serve all students well, we need easy to access information regarding how schools and districts are doing. That pretty much telegraphs your intention, doesn't it?
Right, right. Yeah. And the idea is that for it to be constructive and instructive. How do you help decide how to give school districts the tools they need to target the campuses that need the most help? Whether it's the teaching, whether it's providing additional supports to the students. There are a variety of ways, but I think the most unfortunate consequence on accountability systems itself is that we haven't quite figured out how to tackle the school improvement thing, right? I mean, that is where...
It's easy to identify a need for better performance. It's harder to actually execute upon that need.
And we're not using the data appropriately, right? We're not really looking at what the problems are and how to really target it. And part of that, I think, has to go back even before the system itself.
Yeah. Mr. Crowley, you know, I hear Lizzette say, and I know that she means in her heart, that these accountability systems are supposed to be constructive and to incentivize improvement. But when I talk to superintendents around the state, often they think that the accountability system feels punitive and not constructive. And certainly parents feel that the accountability system feels punitive and not instructive.
So I think we have to separate. We say accountability, but we have an assessment system, and then we have the accountability and the rating part of that system. We couch it under accountability system.
One drives the other.
No doubt.
Right.
I guess from my vantage point, I believe that the assessment system we currently have today is the absolute best assessment system that we've had. It measures growth, it measures absolute performance, it measures college and career readiness. It's the best system that we've had. The rating component of the accountability system is where the punitive issues come in.
Explain.
So when you can identify, let me just take my personal experience, when I can identify how students are progressing over time and get recognized for that, that's a good thing. When I can identify absolute performance and get recognized for that, that's a good thing. When I can identify college and career readiness, that's a good thing. But when you decide to assign a letter grade as a part of the accountability system to my schools and to the district, then that creates unintended consequences. And I think that the accountability system, the rating system that we use, is an oversimplification of a very complex process.
And when you say the assessment piece you're good with, you mean the STAR test as a way to measure those things?
Well, what I mean is that we have to have a way of measuring. And based on what we've done in the past, the current system, not necessarily the STAR test, but the current system that we have where we use multiple measures is a good thing. Now, the STAR test, that's the best of what we have. Can we improve on that? Absolutely.
But the grades are the problem for you, although it sounds, Mr. Ellis, to me like the superintendent is saying, we like it when the grades are good. We just don't like it when the grades are bad. Everybody wants to go to heaven. Nobody wants to die.
So that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
All right.
So, okay, well, let
that's
me,
not what I'm
before I
saying.
ask Mr. Ellis
Yes.
to then explain, because, I mean, of course, everybody wants to be given a positive grade when everything is working well.
Right.
But isn't there always going to be a flip side to that?
Well, I do believe there will always be a flip side, but what I'm saying is that if we can design assessments that will monitor and measure growth. And so if you can tell me how students are growing under my care, then I can actually support that system.
So you're part of the State Board of Education Illuminati, right? You're sort of this other body of elites in this conversation. You don't actually assess performance or punish or praise, really. But you have a lot of inputs that give you an ability to judge whether the system is working or not. What do you think?
Let me go back to a word that you used just a minute ago about who was part of the system and who you used the word suffer, and what's going through with the students with that. In my paying job, my wife appreciates if I stay at my paying job more than I do my volunteer job, but I'm a chiropractor. And we order MRI tests. And when I order an MRI test, I have to look, what's the reason for ordering that test? Is it a valid test? Is it the right test to tell me the information I know? But the key part of ordering that is to make sure that the information I get from that will drive my treatment. And I think the STAR assessment has to be the same way. Will the information we get from that assessment drive instruction? And if we're doing a test just for comparison purposes and it's not driving instruction, then I think we're doing it for the wrong reason.
In other words, you're not offering to stay with this chiropractor analogy, which we're going to overuse here in about 3 seconds. What's the point of doing an MRI if you identify a problem and then don't offer a diagnosis that leads to treatment? Right?
Well, let's call the permanent or the Public School Finance Commission the treatment that we found when we found that diagnosis. We've spent a lot of time and effort working through the problem, through the diagnosis, and what changes we needed to have to make sure that we get to the right treatment.
Right, but the MRI in your office is probably only one of a series of assessments that you could put somebody with back pain through. Why is the MRI the right test? When do you know that it's the right test? And how do we know that the STAR, which is currently the main instrument of assessment, how do we know whether that's the right test?
Well, we can keep going down this road. Let's talk about the STAR test being an MRI and maybe another type of test being an X-ray. There's certain types of, when we order medical tests, there's positives and negatives to it. An MRI is a very expensive test. It gives us a certain amount of data, where an X-ray is going to be a cheaper test, but it also has some harm to the participant with that. So we need to make sure that we have the right test that's measuring the right information in the best way possible.
Lizzette, this is, again, back to the idea that we've been doing this for a long time. It wasn't the STAR test then. It was something else.
There was many other tests.
Many other things, acronyms that have been forgotten to history. The road behind us is littered with the bones of acronyms that have been discarded, right? But how do you know from an assessment standpoint whether this test or any test is an adequate, accurate test, assuming it's executed upon accurately and efficiently and without incident, which lately with the STAR test, not so much.
Right, and well, those were some online, there was technical issues, but, I mean, in the development of the test, right?
But they are issues. I mean,
sure,
that's a little bit like, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? I mean, the fact is, if the STAR test is not, if you have technical problems with the STAR test and you can't get an adequate assessment, I don't want to dismiss those technical problems as insignificant.
No,
right?
no, and that's not, I'm not trying to dismiss it, but what I'm trying to say is there is so much research and there's so much input in the development of the items for these assessments, right? A big part of the contractor's job is bringing in your item developers, which are teachers from higher ed,
right.
K-12, right, that are developing these assessments, plus all these technical advisory committees with psychometricians from all over the country.
Yep.
I mean, you go into some of those meetings and it's like a whole other language, right, that even, it took me like a few years to really even understand what, beyond the introductions what they were saying, right? So there is so much work that comes into development of these assessments. Now, I mean, and I'm not dismissing, I think that Commissioner Rath and former Chief Deputy Penny Schwinn did an amazing job with this new contractor with, that they identified to do the STAR test. But there are so many things that go involved, and you know, these glitches are happening as more assessments move into this online environment, and so there has to be some. Now, should there have been some? Should the consequences have existed on the kids themselves due to those technical reasons? Well, that I think was probably the big issue.
But generally speaking, the STAR test, from your perspective, is a worthy instrument.
They do correlations out the Yahoo, right? And that is why so many. So when it comes down to the assessments themselves, again, this is just to be a measure of where students are, right? And what you're supposed to do. Now, are there issues with it being so late that maybe the teacher, incoming teacher, doesn't really know like how that student did the year before? I mean, that's all, you know, it's all kind of an ebb and flow anyway. But the assessments themselves aren't the issue. It's again the way they're used.
It's process, right?
Right. It should. I think we should be thinking of them more in that diagnostic nature, and we have to think.
Right.
Do we want to measure our standards? Does Texas want to know where their kids are on their standards?
As a principal.
Right.
As a principal, yes or no, do we want to have a benchmark?
Exactly.
To
and that's
measure
what the
against.
state board does for us, right?
Yeah. Mr. Ellis.
Yeah, and so there's been talk about other different types of assessments out there, and I think that's the benefit that we have at the STAR is it's a measurement of our TEKS. When you look at the SAT or ACT, then you're looking at a different set of standards. I think there is another measurement, the TSI, that's another form of a assessment that's going to cover, you know, the Texas standards, and those are avenues that we can go to. Now, when we dig a little bit deeper into whether the STAR is accurate, we've looked at some of the current topics that are going on, or some of the current discussion about Lexile levels and so forth, and that's where the State Board of Education does come into this. And so if you look at what the standard's assessing, it's our TEKS. And we go back to what our TEKS say. It says that the child should read grade level text with fluency and comprehension. So the question is, what is grade level text? And that's what this is focused around. We had someone, we had our discussion on English language arts that came in and said that you need to have author lists and title lists as part of the standards so that we all know exactly where every student should be at. In fact, I spoke with someone at the agency just earlier this week who said, I wish that would have been part of the standards so that it would make the assessment easier with that. One of the groups that came in was a group from Massachusetts, and they have that in part of their curriculum standards. So I went and looked at that, and I looked at what Massachusetts has. Well, they have a group of title and authors that are for K through 2. They have a group from 3 through 4 and a group from 5 through 8. So even Massachusetts, who was pushing for this, didn't have it narrowed down of a reading list or an author list that was more narrow than 5th through 8th grade. So I think when we get to look at what should be assessed, what grade level text should be, I want to focus on what the teachers in the classroom feels that a student should be learning, what fits their students best, and I think that's what goes into student learning, and then when you bring this assessment issue into it, that's when that gets a little bit muddy.
So again, what I'm hearing is the issue is not so much the STAR test in and of itself, but the process around it, the preparation for it, and all that.
Sure.
So you're good with the STAR test?
The STAR test is our STAR test. It's measuring our standards. And that's why I want to, if there are issues with it, this is a system of continuous improvement. Let's fix what we have that's focused on our standards.
Mr. King, the world needs a hero, and there are a lot of people out in the world who want you to be the lone voice on this and say the STAR test is terrible, kill the STAR test, burn it, torch it, and then run over it with your car.
I'm all for it.
Are you for that? Okay.
You know,
what's wrong with the STAR
test? I honestly
test?
think we ought to just change the name so we can cuss somebody else for a while. There will be a test. I mean, we're going to have a test.
Whatever they replace this with, you're going to hate also.
You're going to hate it. Everybody hated the tax test. I was on the school board when we were getting rid of the tax test. And one of the big gripes during the tax test days is we weren't measuring potential. We weren't, and so the STAR test went to measure, it not only tests kids on their grade level, but it also tests them on stuff they've never heard of. And now we don't like that. So are we going to reverse course and go back to the tax that tested the TEKS? Or are we going to call the STAR test something else? The whole point of the accountability system on the test, it needs to meet the bare minimum requirement of ESSA.
Yep.
As far as your accountability system. Most of your accountability systems should be developed in your local districts. And we've already done that at the high school level. Let's don't forget that. We've made huge strides on the A through F program, and I know school districts don't like the label. I don't care if you call it red, yellow, black, or green. Makes me no difference. That was a parent, taxpayer-driven initiative because it's easy for people to understand this district's an A, this district's a C, the old system
So I want to come back to the grades, and before I go back to the superintendent, Mr. King, you talked about developing at the local level some sense of where these kids did. We talk about one size fits all. We've talked about it several times today, several times last night. The STAR test is basically a one size fits all assessment, is it not?
It is.
You are from a rural part of the state. Mr. Ellis, you're from a rural part of the state. Mr. McFarland, you're from Crowley, which is in Tarrant County, which is a more urban part of the state. We sit here in Austin, an urban part of the state. Mr. King, should there be one assessment for every kid? Is there a different accountability assessment or instrument or metric for rural Texas versus urban Texas? Should there be a different assessment or accountability measure for wealthy districts and poor districts? Like, is there a way for us to cut this up and divide it? Should we do that? Some people want to do that.
There's not a way for us to do it. We're going to have a test that is 50% of our accountability system because we take federal dollars. That's what the ESSA says we have to do.
Yeah.
But the other 50% should be developed mainly at the local level, which is what we're attempting to do, and then a small portion for the state. So 40-10 suits me. And the problem is 3 through 8. 3 through 8, there's nothing to measure. The old system was 100% the test. This system is 100% the test because when you're a third grader, you can measure the test or you can measure attendance, but attendance is a grade on the parent, not the kid. So we have to develop, and that's something Commissioner Morath is working on, is developing something that can be standardized for every district of the state to meet the state's portion of it and let the rest of the accountability system be developed at the local level.
Mr. Crowley, are we measuring what kids know, or are we measuring how teachers structure the teaching over the course of the year toward the test? This is always the big knock on one of these tests, is that if you give people the test and you say that we're going to base funding or any other kind of goodies on the basis of the performance on this test, that we're going to structure everything toward that. What are we measuring here?
I think that is the question. I mean, it's designed in concept to measure our standards. But in reality, we oftentimes are measuring students' preparation before they got to that course.
Right. I mean, to Mr. Ellis's point, it would be good to have some prep on reading lists and authors and all that, but all that would be doing is preparing them essentially for the measurement, not necessarily preparing them for the world.
No doubt. And so I think community-based accountability is one avenue, and I know several superintendents around and others around. We're working on designing what a local community-based accountability system would look like.
In addition to?
In addition to, we recognize that we want accountability. We want to be assessed. We know that there is some merit in having all students across the state take an assessment to know where we are in relation to others as well as where we are in relation to where we should be. But in addition to that, we believe that community-based accountability should have as much impact on whether or not schools are doing a good job.
And what would community-based accountability look like?
Well, it depends on it depends on your community. But what we do know is that students enrolling in technical programs, students enrolling in higher ed, students being engaged in extracurricular activities, students being involved in producing products, collaborating, having portfolios, a lot of these things are much more valuable than students being able to pass a test on one day. For a student to be able to stand forward as a fifth grader and have an electronic portfolio where they can demonstrate what they've learned over the last 5 years, or there's all kinds of different creative ways to do it.
Right.
And I believe we can put it together if we have public and private local businesses and corporations working together to say, hey, this is what we want our students to be able to do when they leave the fifth grade. This is what we want them to do as they graduate.
Lizzette, there's a commonality to the objective assessment of a STAR test. There's something subjective about what Mr. McFarland is talking about in every community. Maybe that's a positive. I don't know.
So, I mean, the way I think of it is kind of like big A and little a accountability. The piece is the transparency, right? What does this mean? What is an A? What is a B? What's a D and F? And it's more on the reporting side, which again, Texas has made some tremendous strides in reporting the results of their students, right, to the parents. But there's more to that. And so should you add to that reporting requirement the school climate issue, right, which is what I think you're trying to talk about, or about data outside of once they graduate from high school, where do kids go?
Right.
In Kentucky, they have a data system where they brought in higher ed data, they brought in the workforce data and education data. They're their own little agency, and they basically report. They use student test scores, but then they also track where these kids end up, where they go to school, 2-year, 4-year career, what they're doing, what their job wages are. And so is there a way to kind of reverse engineer that into, then that becomes part of the story.
So you start
of what
with
these districts.
You start with the citizenship piece of the workforce piece, and you work your way back. You reverse engineer from that.
Yeah.
That's the outbound goal. How do we prepare kids for citizenship? How do we prepare them to enter the workforce? You build that backwards, and then you assess accountability along the way.
Yes, to the extent to really, again, on the
Toward
reporting
that.
side. Again, I am going to distinguish between big A, which I think is your, whatever you want to call it. We're going to have labels on school districts and on campuses.
Right.
We need to. We need to be transparent to our parents how they're doing. Again, how you use that data
Right.
is different. That's your big A. Your little a then is the reporting piece. So where are these kids going? Where are your kids graduating? Are they going into the workforce? Are they staying in the community? Are they going to Dallas? Are they going to the finance? Using data is, if we could really figure out this data piece, we could probably bring the noise down about accountability, because we want to give the full picture of what's happening in those classrooms.
Mr. Crowley, the point here, I'm hearing Lizzette talk about giving people the full data. The theory here is that you are empowering communities to take responsibility for improving education, right? So you provide this data back to parents and to school leaders and community leaders, and they're in turn going to use that to drive performance improvements. That's the theory. Does that happen in the real world as you see it, in your real world?
I think it depends. It really depends on how locally you use the information that you receive. But the information is not just the data that we receive from assessments. There are other data, there's other information that we collect and we use to be able to give back or talk to our local people about what it is we're doing. But even more importantly, as it relates to accountability, we have to answer the question of really what's the purpose of it? Is accountability designed for us to assess learning, or is it designed for us to learn what we're doing in the process? Is it for learning or of learning?
Or both.
Or both. Well, but the reality is, in order for us to use the accountability system like it's designed, we have to be able to get the information and then be able to apply the information within our system. So testing in May or April and getting the results back in June and August for the students that are gone, we can't help them. And so what I'm saying is that
it's like a general fighting the last war.
Yeah.
Right?
So my deal would be if we want to say use this information to learn, we got to be assessing at the very beginning once we get students in the school, and use that information all year to be able to make some decisions.
You're going to
But
jump
part
in
of the professional development during the summer, right before school starts, should be this ability to give the incoming teacher of record the information of their students and how they scored on that test, right? That's how you use it to again, drive, instruction and identification.
It's handed
Who
off
can
to the
determine-
it's handed off to the next
handing
teacher.
off that, making it very deliberate.
Right.
That these teachers are going to know where their kids landed on the STAR
And-
as far as they're in relation to the Texas standards.
Right.
Right. And then how do you provide those supports to those teachers to be able to, again, diversify instruction, help the kids move that are moving along, the ones that are struggling, support. I mean, it's almost like MSSS.
Right, but
Except
in concept, that works perfect for the adult. But what about the student that has experienced it the entire year?
Right.
And now that student's gone to the next school, the next grade level. The information that we receive, unless we're able to take this information then and go to the next grade level and work with that teacher, that may or may not translate. So what I'm saying is that if this assessment is designed to improve the experience of the student, then we need to do it differently.
Mr. Ellis, why do people hate this conversation so much?
Yeah, well,
I mean, parents hate the STAR test. People, you both know this. You hear this politically. Politicians use the STAR test as a punching bag. Parents hate the STAR test.
I'm a parent.
Come on.
Because I think of how it's reported. And let's go look at how our STAR report card is given to us. I actually have a very rich piece of data now, and some of you may have seen your student STAR report card. It gives where they're at, whether they're at meets or approaches or does not meet. It gives a growth level, where they are along the spectrum, gives Lexile reading levels of books they can choose. There's a lot of very data-rich information there. What do we see when we see it from a community level, from a district level? We open that same report card and we either see an A, or a D, or a C. It doesn't give us a lot of information. Now, that information is there. It's at txschools.gov that gives the same amount of information, but I've never heard a news report talk about that. All they see is an A or D. And I can, if you don't mind, I want to turn this a little personal on you. I actually went to Google.
Okay.
Yeah.
Assess me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So I went to Google reviews, and let's pretend that that's your assessment. You actually have 3.4 stars at the Texas Tribune out of 5. That's what everything you do is boiled down to in the public's
That's because the
perspective.
governor and lieutenant governor each gave us 1 star.
They've rated it down a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, you have a lot of articles and journalistic and events and things like this. You have extracurricular for your staff. You have ping pong tables. I'm sure you have great vending machines
did
for
beat
your...
Sticklin', that's
I
true,
did see that. But all of that information is boiled down into 3.4 stars. And I would assume that you're not good with that. That doesn't tell your whole story. There's more to it. You're not going to go put a billboard out there that says Texas Tribune, 3.4 stars, but that's what our communities are being asked to do. And I think if you can really get that story out there and get more information there, then this all starts to work together.
3.4, honestly, is better than I would have thought.
It's out of a scale of 5, not 4.
We
though.
are enemies of the people. I mean, that's not actually bad. Representative King, you all thought enough of accountability as a concept here that you put it into the School Finance Commission report in a bunch of areas, right? Didn't you say you wanted to use accountability to base funding decisions? You were, at least for that period of time, thinking about tying performance to some measure of pay, to some measure of performance. That's a form of accountability. You all thought well enough about accountability to include it in the School Finance Commission report.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, I bet
No,
you
I'm
don't
just
remember
kidding.
that.
No.
Yeah.
No.
What happened?
Listen, we talked a lot, and I see Todd Williams, who was a big part of the commission as well, and on the performance-based pay, and we heard tremendous amount of testimony about the ACE program in Dallas.
Right.
And those who have participated in that know it's been a phenomenal program. You have the best teachers teaching in the hardest campuses to teach at, and some of them are making close to 6 figures, I believe, and trying to emulate that around the state is what we were trying to do. What the original part of House Bill 3 said is it allowed for a locally based accountability system for a performance-based pay system. It's $140 million of a permissive program in a $9 billion bill, and school teachers lost their minds over being tied to the STAR test in any way, shape, or form.
There's a back door, by the way, if you want to leave after this.
No,
panel is over.
I mean, I think it's a fair argument. It's something that I've worked on for a long time and I believe in. You know, and I get it. Schools are not private business, but in private business, people don't stay in business without time pay to performance. What I was trying to work with Mr. Williams and the rest of the commission in House Bill 3 is an ACE-like program, because we've seen tremendous results with something that works in rural Texas. Hang on a minute. I still believe in it. Now, the school teacher unions were ready to tank the entire $9 billion package over a $140 million permissive program. Now, to me, in my world, if you're scared of being measured and you're willing to tank the whole program, because I know a lot of great school teachers who would have loved the ability in rural Texas to make an extra $32,000 a year and wouldn't have minded being measured. But overall, it tanked. We took it out. It is what it is. Difference of opinion. I wasn't willing to sacrifice the bill over it.
Right. And Mr. Crowley, that's an interesting way to think about it. Don't be afraid of being measured, right? At the end of the day, we're all judged in our lives and our work. Why be afraid of being measured?
So, I don't know if it was their fear of being measured, and I really can't speak for them, because actually I've been a part of systems where we've had outcome-based funding. We didn't call it that. It was our TAP system and strategic funding for performance. And so I've been a part of those systems, and it's been successful. I do believe that the ACE model, the strategic compensation component, it gives us our best hope, I believe, because we know that students from poverty, students that have gaps, they need the best teachers. It's a common sense approach in my opinion.
What is preventing you in Crowley from doing what I see Superintendent Hinojosa back there has done in Dallas with some celebrity and success, and that is taking the best performing teachers and putting them in the lowest performing schools? Why can't every superintendent do what he did?
So nothing is preventing us from doing it. We're actually making a move to do that next year. And so I think just giving us the time, the space, and the resources, we have those now. We have the guidance, and so we're looking forward to being able to do that.
It doesn't require legislation, does it, Mr. Ellis? I mean, the fact is every school district could make that same decision.
Correct, and I think the other side of this is you've got the teacher performance pay that as Representative King said, is got to be highly dependent, if it goes through, on local decisions. What works for Superintendent Hinojosa in Dallas is not going to work in Lufkin, Texas. I've got other schools or districts in my region. If the idea is to move your best teachers to your neediest campuses, they only have one campus. And so some of those things have to be thought through.
Right, so this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all deal.
On the performance-based pay, more than we wanted it to reward school teachers that are doing a great job for a retention piece. But in rural Texas, recruitment is so hard. And if you live 100 miles from the nearest city at all, so if you live in northeastern Panhandle and Amarillo is your closest city, and you're at a school district that's can pay a highly qualified AP teacher $50,000. But you have the ability to say the state's going to kick in an extra 30 or 40 grand a year for you to come to this district. Now we have incentive to get good teachers into rural Texas, and frankly, we're one of the most underserved populations.
So you may be able to improve education through that.
Right. And the other thing, Evan, before we get off this subject, let's talk about teacher pay for a minute, what the House is trying to do versus the Senate. The House is putting what we're proposing in statute, which means somebody like me has to come back in a future session and file a bill to take your money away.
Undo it.
That's right. The Senate is proposing a one-time pay raise, which at best is a 60% bonus because the 40% is going to the pension, and they didn't fund any money for the pension liability from the state or the district. So you're getting 40% off the top. So at best, you got a partial bonus. At worst, and most likely, you got an unfunded mandate because they're not put in statute. And that's not semantics. That's a real promise, and that's something I'm not willing to do. I'm for giving all teachers more money if we can, and however we come up with a way, but it has to be statutorily guaranteed, or I can't support it.
Lizzette, let me ask you about the A through F, which has come up a couple times. This is the other half of what Superintendent McFarland was talking about. So there's the assessment, and then there is the assessment of the assessment, essentially, or the assessment of the results.
Right, yeah, sure.
So I reminded myself, I went on the website again to look at the A through F grades. First set came out in August of 2018. The next set will come out again this year. We're measuring three things: student achievement, school progress, and closing the gaps.
Right.
The student achievement part is how well students perform on the state standardized tests and whether they're college and career ready. Anything wrong with that being a way to hold schools and districts accountable? School progress, how much students are improving on state tests. Again, there's state tests again, right? And then closing the gaps, how well schools are boosting scores for subgroups such as students with special needs and English language learners. To the uninitiated, this basically just seems like star test, star test, star test, star test.
Well, and in high school, there's more indicators, obviously, like completion of dual enrollment or
But these are the basics.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, so I think we are having these conversations at the national level, right? What other indicators really make sense in accountability systems that are valid, reliable, measurable, right? And so the hard part is the other things, right? And so should that be part of an A through F system? I don't think so. Like, again, social emotional learning is very hot right now, right? Everybody's talking about it. The Aspen Institute has a document called the SEED, which is social emotional academic development, right? Because if you provide the right supports, well, you have some organizations that say, well, we got to measure that. Well, you're not going to measure some kids' grit. You're not going to measure whether or not they're engaged. I mean, that is on the adults in the system.
Right, but you acknowledge what Representative King said earlier, that it would be wrong not to judge the success of parents in getting their kids situated in some of these situations.
Again, but like he said, you can't build that into a state system where, I mean, that's maybe truancy, I mean, just because it affects ADA, right? But the idea, again, is, you know, like, how do you help, like, I think it's a school climate issue. It's a school safety issue. That's what SEL is about. It's about having an environment where students feel safe, they have healthy relationships with the adults in that school, and there's a mutual trust.
And that is on the schools to provide that.
Absolutely, right? And so, but that's kind of, for me, part of that little A accountability. How do you really develop and be very transparent about what schools and campuses are offering their students? But it shouldn't be part of the A through F.
You have a national perspective, a little bit different from the other folks up on this stage. Are there other states that do this assessment piece better than Texas? Can you tell us about a state?
So Mississippi, believe it or not, is doing amazing things using A through F.
Mississippi at this point ought to just change its name to Mississippi, believe it or not.
But again, they, you know, and then also Florida does a really great job.
Yep.
You know, Colorado's pretty good. As far as the system in of itself, again, the work that has happened at the agency has been tremendous, right? But part of the problem, I think, with Texas's system is that those first two domains, the student overall achievement and growth, basically it's kind of like you only have to do one really well to get credit.
Right,
so,
that's 70%.
Right. It's 70%, right? And then, and then part of the growth domain, which again we have somewhat problems are, is the fact that it is growth in comparison to similar demographics. And what I think that does is it just lowers expectations for students that are in more risk communities.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is if you lower expectations enough, anybody can get a good grade, right? I mean, that's the standard.
Right. And I think the other part of that, too, that's the challenge is we're trying to balance continuous improvement of the system versus something the commissioners talked about is trying to keep this constant over 5 years to make sure that you can see progress over time. Dr. LaTanya Goffney's sitting over in the corner here, and I hired her when I was on the Lufkin School Board. And I want to tell her a little secret. When we hired her, we went back and looked at where she came from. And we looked at all the other applications of superintendents and looked at where they came from. And the problem was, every 2 years, the system changed, so we were never able to go back and measure growth over time. And that's what I think is one of the key important pieces that we have, is to keep it constant. And then also what Lizzette was talking about also is the fact that it's a best of system. That's another key part of that. There are some school districts that are always going to do well on proficiency. In the Woodlands and in Highland Park, their kids are going to show up to third grade and they're going to pass the third grade reading test on day one.
And they're going to be, to the point of SEL, they're also going to be better prepared coming in the door to do well.
We have some other districts in our area that their students are going to come in third grade reading 2 grades behind. And there's a lot of growth that needs to happen. And both of those areas can be done well as long as we do a best of.
And Mr. McFarland, to the point that Mr. King made earlier, it doesn't make a difference whether you call it A, B, C, D, F, or red, blue, green, orange, yellow. It's still going to be an assessment of some sort, right? People are still going to bristle at the suggestion that they're not red, but they're yellow.
No doubt, that's definitely likely to happen. I think when we do A, B, C, D, and F, and you give one grade to indicate a overall performance in all these different domains, it just really simplifies it. And I do like the idea of assigning a grade per domain. You know, because then I can actually look at that and understand it. But when
you
you give me one single grade,
you just don't want an overall grade.
I think the overall grade
Right.
is an oversimplification.
A little bit like the School Finance Commission associated what it would cost to fix public ed by each individual item, but then at the end wouldn't come to us with an overall number.
Who are you talking to?
I'm staring directly at you.
Oh,
actually,
I'm sorry.
on
The
that.
light was in my eye. I couldn't see you.
Before we go to audience questions, and I appreciate if you all are texting and tweeting in questions for our audience, should we be tying, Mr. King, funding of public education to outcomes? That is kind of the question everybody on this stage is being asked today. Let me ask it of you directly. Should we be tying funding of public education to outcomes, yes or no?
No.
Why?
I think, as we've all talked about, any accountability system, we're going to have outcomes, and that's going to be the test, whatever it is. But that doesn't have to be all of it. The federal law only requires for a majority of a state's accountability system to be a standardized test. The rest of it needs to be locally developed, and it needs to be a growth model. And performance pay should be based on growth, and that should be determined at the local level as much as possible. And so outcomes should be based on growth, not measured by the test, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Should we be tying funding to outcomes?
You know, it's the same question. Do we tie police officer or firefighters funding to their outcomes? You know, we're going to pay them to do the job and do the job well, and I think the same thing can be applied here. Are we going to pay teachers to do their job or do their job well? When you look at how we got to this point on the School Finance Commission, you know, and I mentioned to someone that I would hope that maybe we can win the commission with a 7-6 vote. But if we went back to the legislature and say, guess what, there was disagreement in school finance, I don't think that helped anyone. We ended up with a unanimous decision, and part of that was bringing all these different pieces to the table and all these different ideas like what we're talking about here. But the idea of tying funding to performance doesn't benefit the students in my mind.
Mr. McFarland, would you want your funding tied to outcomes, yes or no?
So what I would want is a way to invest in full day pre-K. I want a way to invest in recruiting and incentivizing my best teachers to work in my most challenging schools. I want a way to incentivize local partnerships, public and private partnerships. So that's what I'm for.
You didn't really answer my question.
So that's my answer is any system that gives us an opportunity to do those things, that's what I would support.
Are you on the outcomes-based funding train? I suspect you probably are.
So the way the House wrote it initially, right? It was an incentive. It was an extra incentive. It wasn't you're tying the whole system's funding to outcomes.
Is
right?
tying
because
the whole
we are
system's
gonna have,
funding a bad idea to outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because we're going to have kids that are going to be struggling all over the place.
So then, what are the real world consequences then for poor performance through the assessment mechanism?
So that's the idea of where whatever those the 32%, the D and Fs, then how do we rethink how to really serve those schools? Now, there should be consequences if after the supports are provided, the strategy is given. I mean, the agency, whatever happens in that, in the improvement of that school, if they are not succeeding, continuing to fail those kids, then yes, they should just get closed, turned over.
And that is
whatever.
the point at which the state interposes itself. Right. That's
but first, you have to use the system as a diagnostic. Identify, diagnose, and intervene. Right. That should be the first steps before you go to the extreme. But you have to build in incentives so that the DF schools, and I can tell you there are some districts that I think should be a D, because if you look at their campuses, you'll have some campuses on maybe the poorer side of town that are college readiness rates in the single digits, but yet the district continues to get a high rating. So it's the transparency piece, right? That's the part. And being able to understand why a district is D or why is F. When we would do school improvement and we would identify school districts, you always had this like massive number of schools. And so our teams would go in, and then you'd go, oh, we were supposed to be teaching the standards? What's the takes, right? Right. Professional development got in there, they turned it around. So it's really just being able to understand what is or not happening at that campus, being able to empower superintendents to make the right decisions for that campus, as well as the principals themselves. I mean, there's everybody needs to be part of the system and
Got it.
the solutions.
Good. Emily, let's go to some questions from the audience.
Sure. And is this working?
Yeah, go ahead. You're good.
Just blame this on my Texas education. So this Austin, who is from Leander, says that currently a student can pass all STAR tests and still be woefully unprepared for higher education. Do we want our minimum standards to be so far off from the mark from where students need to be successful in higher education?
Do any of you think that the STAR test is not rigorous enough? For all the criticisms of the STAR test, is the STAR test not rigorous enough in terms of what it's telling us about the preparedness of kids to go on through education, Mr. Ellis?
I think that's the first time I've heard the phrase the STAR test is not rigorous enough.
Not rigorous
Yeah.
enough.
So,
Right.
it is more than just understanding, what they get on each test grade. As long as the districts are preparing the whole student, and it's more than just the test, but preparing the whole student, then I do believe that the STAR test is going to be part of that. The outcomes are going to be where they need to be, and they will be successful where they move on.
Are you satisfied, Mr. McFarland, that if the kids in your district successfully pass the STAR test, that they're ready for what comes next?
I think the STAR test is a good indicator of who's on track to be ready, but I think there are other indicators as well.
So it's possible to pass the STAR test and not be college or workforce ready, and it's possible to not pass the STAR test and be college ready.
It's one of those trap doors.
Yeah, that's a trap door, right?
I'm in the trap door business,
there are other
Mr.
things that are
McFarland.
also predictive of college readiness as well. I mean, you can look at a student's grades in 8th grade, in algebra particularly, and determine whether they're able to be successful the first year of college and all that. So I think there are other
Then they should be
indicators.
successful on the STAR,
Yeah.
right? There should be that correlation.
It depends, though. The STAR test is one test on one day. And so they, in algebra, the whole year, they have supports and all. So I think the system, what we're trying to do is we're trying to use an accountability system, one system, to do a whole lot of things. And I think we ought to step back to say, hey, look, this accountability system may assess whether students are learning the content, but is it an indication of all the other inputs that we have?
In other words, are you prepared to put the entire ball of wax in the hands of this one thing? Right.
That's the question I think we have to ask. That's what we're, in some ways, doing that.
Right. Emily.
Sure. We've had a few questions about school boards, and Natasha, who is a school board member, wants to know how they are being held accountable for student outcomes.
Right. We talked about whether accountability was after parents or students or teachers, but you've both been presidents of school boards. Shouldn't we be holding you all accountable as the governance mechanism over these school districts? Isn't that where you go?
Yeah, I think the buck stops with the, and people think that the superintendent is the leader of the district, but the board's vision is what should drive that superintendent's goals. And when you have that, then yes, the buck does start with the school board, but also even within our school finance commission, there's a piece of that requires school boards to place goals on third grade literacy, on math scores. And the idea is that we have to make sure that the boards understand what their vision is.
You were elected in Lufkin to the school board, correct?
Correct.
You were elected to the school board in Canadian.
I was.
Right. So is the accountability on school board members that if you don't do a good job, we toss you out of office the next time? Or should there be some other form of accountability?
The ultimate accountability for any elected official is the voters. And, if your community doesn't care enough to unelect that leader, then they're going to continue to be a bad leader.
Maybe like property taxes, if our students don't improve by 2.5% a year, we ought to go to the voters and ask whether you get to keep your jobs.
If you could get them to show up.
If we can get them to show up, which is not an insignificant thing. Emily.
So we have a question about STAR tests coming out at the end of the year, when there's little time to diagnose and treat, students.
Right. I think that one we kind of addressed sort of through Mr. McFarland. Let's go to the next one.
How do we get a proper and effective assessment that kind of moves away from this idea of reward versus punishment?
Is there a way to have an assessment that does not, where the consequences up or down are not so high? I guess we call that high stakes.
Right.
Is it possible to have a non-high stakes assessment?
I think you can move away from it. an assessment's always going to have stakes to it, and I think even the commissioners talked about ways that we can make our assessment system and our accountability system less high stakes. For example, there's some tests that we are using that aren't federally required. We could get rid of, I believe it's the high school social studies EOC, the 8th grade EOC, some of the writing tests. You can also do it where it's not just one test one day. You can even it out over a couple days where it's not all just a test of their endurance. There's some different ways that you can take the current system away from that ledge.
But removing social studies, why? Well, then what's the point of having the class, right? I mean, again, it is important that our kids understand the U.S. Constitution and what's involved in that. So I think the idea should be the end of course exams, which some districts use, Algebra 2 and English 3. They use it as a diagnostic, right? They use it. They have chosen to continue to administer those assessments so that they can see where those kids are, because those are correlated to college readiness, right? If you pass English 3 end of course or Algebra 2 end of course, you're guaranteed no remediation in post-secondary, whatever that post-secondary path is that you choose. So it's not about getting rid of tests, right? It's just about, again, rethinking the high stakes nature of it, which I'll come back to this. One of the mistakes that we made back in the day in House Bill 3, I think it was SB whatever, was the 15 end of course exams, right? The idea wasn't that we're going to take all these tests. The linchpin, what killed it, was the 15% cumulative score, right? That was a guarantee for graduation. That's what scared parents. But if you use those extra EOCs to really understand where kids are and where they're learning, then everybody can understand where they are. And as far as this idea of it being a summative, it's at the end of the year, well, absolutely, that's why it's part of the accountability system, right? We want to see how that school did with those kids to the end of the year. Whatever benchmarks, whatever they did up to that point, are their grades really correlating with the end of tests? Yeah. And then thinking about how you use it to maximize its impact in the next school year. But getting rid of tests is not the
Mr. King, I remember a couple of years ago when the debate at the legislature was over the reduction of the number of end-of-course exams, and it went from 15 to 5. And there were some people who thought that 5 was still too many. I bet if you polled members individually in the legislature now, there'd be a lot who would tell you that they still think 5 is too many.
Yeah, I hear 3 all the time.
Right.
But 5 has seemed to work, but where we're still lacking on the 5, on having 5 in the course exams, we're lacking in career and technical. When the budget cuts happened in 2011, they were never restored, but yet we under House Bill 5, we created all these 5 pathways to graduation, 3 of which are career and technical, but we haven't given particularly small districts the tools and the resources to meet the career and technical standards set out by the commissioner. So we still have a lot of work to do on college readiness. I have a bill that I'm proposing right now that would allow as an option an 11th grader to take ACT, SAT, and TSI prep and then take one of those tests as their exit exam. And it makes sense. I mean, my son's in college right now. Nobody ever asked him what he made on his STAR test. They cared a lot about his ACT. But that's not an option for everybody. That's not an option for the kid that's going to career military readiness. That's not an option for a trade school, but it should be an option for those college-bound students, because once their junior year's over, higher ed doesn't care. I mean, we had a debate in the School Finance Commission about the merit of doing away with 12th grade and putting it back in pre-K. And which it's a unique
Was that
idea.
A serious conversation or a fanciful conversation?
Well, it was we had a whole day of testimony on it. I mean, right. and there was a lot of discussion about you getting more bang for your buck. But I'm telling you, our higher ed institutes,
you could just rename kindergarten pre-K. It's like changing the numbers on floors in a building. Couldn't you just?
But how do you better utilize that 12th grade year, right? You have many schools, you have charter schools, public schools that are using the early college high school model, that are helping kids in their junior and senior years actually get their associate's degrees, and then advancing that into the post-secondary or career of their choice.
I totally agree with you.
Right?
But we need to allow those kids that know they're college bound to use funding to move on and not have to take more EOC exams that don't matter.
But if they're college bound, they're done with their tests by their sophomore year. They're done. If they're college bound. And I think the other thing that we have to also remember is that the career and technical pathways right now are very rigorous. They require higher levels of coursework. It's not what I grew up with back in the day with shop, right? And even automotive.
Well, when that bill was being debated, the then Commissioner of Education worried that was a dumping ground, right? There was some discussion.
But a lot of career and technical in places that I represent are non-existent, is the point.
Right, I get it. There needs to be that investment in, absolutely. Right. But part of that is being able to bring the community in to really understand, like especially in the rural communities, how do you keep those kids? How do you build the workforce that they can go into, right? But it's got to be at a high level, and that's what Perkins 5 is about, and what the allotment y'all do in CTE.
Let me let Mr. McFarland have the last word, and then we're going to wrap.
So, this idea, this conversation around assessment and accountability is important. But what I think there's an assumption that's being made. The assumption is that if the state doesn't mandate the assessment, then assessments are not occurring. And what I'm saying is that teachers locally within schools are assessing. We are continuing to do end-of-course exams, but they're not state mandated. They're driven by the teacher. And I think we have to give some acknowledgement that teachers locally can create assessment that measures students' progress.
That are worthy.
That are worthy, no doubt.
Okay, good. Well, that's an upbeat note to end on, right? Please thank Mr. Ellis, Mr. King, Mr. McFarland, and Ms. Gonzalez Reynolds. We'll be back in a few minutes with our next panel. Thank you.